Look at a Pontiac GTO spec sheet from 1970, and its 400 cubic inch V8 carries a factory rating of 366 horsepower. Look at the exact same basic engine, largely unchanged mechanically, just 4 years later in 1974, and it's suddenly rated at barely 200 horsepower. That's not a typo, and it's not a case of Chevrolet secretly building a worse engine. It's the exact same fundamental hardware, caught in the middle of one of the strangest, least understood transitions in the entire history of the American automobile industry. A transition that made nearly every performance car in the country look dramatically weaker almost overnight, even when the real-world difference was considerably smaller than the numbers on paper ever suggested. This isn't a countdown of 10 cars from a single year. This is a story of exactly why every muscle car in America suddenly appeared to become so much slower, almost all at once. This is the story of three separate, overlapping changes that hit the entire American auto industry within the same few-year window. A new, more honest way of measuring horsepower, a mandatory drop in compression ratios to accommodate new fuel requirements, and the arrival of catalytic converters that fundamentally restricted how an engine was allowed to breathe. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly which of these changes actually reduced real-world performance, and which ones simply changed the number printed on a window sticker without changing much about how a car actually felt to drive. This is the story of three separate, overlapping changes that hit the entire American auto industry within the same few-year window. A new, more honest way of measuring horsepower, a mandatory drop in compression ratios to accommodate new fuel requirements, and the arrival of catalytic converters that fundamentally restricted how an engine was allowed to breathe. By the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly which of these changes actually reduced real-world performance, and which ones simply changed the number printed on a window sticker without changing much about how a car actually felt to drive. Through 1970, virtually every American manufacturer rated its engines using something called the SAE gross horsepower standard, testing a bare engine on a stand completely disconnected from its alternator, power steering pump, full exhaust system, and every other accessory that would normally rob real power once actually installed under the hood of a customer's car. It was, by nearly every honest measure, an inflated number, closer to a laboratory best-case scenario than anything resembling real-world performance. Starting with the 1971 model year, the industry began transitioning toward the SAE net standard, testing the engine fully dressed, exactly as it would sit in the actual car a customer drove home from the dealership. At almost the exact same moment, new federal fuel and emissions requirements forced compression ratios down across the board, and a looming 1975 deadline for mandatory catalytic converters was already reshaping how Detroit's engineers were designing every new engine coming down the pipeline. Three genuinely separate forces, all converging within the same narrow window. The switch from gross to net horsepower ratings wasn't primarily driven by regulation at all. It was largely a voluntary industry shift toward more accurate, more consumer-honest advertising, though the timing lined up almost perfectly with several other genuine performance-reducing changes happening simultaneously. The gap between the two measurement systems could be enormous. An engine that tested at 450 horsepower gross, disconnected from every accessory that would normally load it down, might only produce 325 horsepower once fully installed and dressed exactly as a customer would actually drive it. That's not a story about an engine getting weaker, it's a story about an industry finally admitting how much power its accessories, exhaust systems, and real-world installation had always been quietly absorbing, all along hidden behind years of inflated gross ratings that nobody had seriously challenged before. Chevrolet's own 454 cubic inch big block offers one of the clearest, most frequently cited examples of exactly how confusing this transition actually was. In 1970, the fearsome LS6 version, rated under the old gross standard, carried an official 450 horsepower rating, the highest number any American manufacturer had ever officially attached to a production muscle car engine. By 1971, with the LS6 now exclusive to the Corvette and measured under the new NET standard, that same basic architecture carried a rating of 425 horsepower gross or 325 horsepower net. Numbers that, taken at face value without understanding the measurement change, made it look like Chevrolet had gutted the engine by nearly 100 horsepower in a single model year. In reality, the underlying hardware had barely changed at all. The yardstick measuring it had simply gotten more honest. It's worth understanding exactly why removing lead from gasoline created such a fundamental problem for Detroit's high-performance engines in the first place. Tetraethyl lead, added to gasoline since the 1920s, had served two genuinely important functions: boosting the fuel's octane rating to prevent dangerous engine knock under high compression, and providing a protective cushioning layer for softer valve seat materials commonly used in engines throughout this entire era. Removing lead from gasoline meant engines needed either lower compression ratios to avoid knock on the new lower octane fuel, or hardened valve seats to survive without lead's protective cushioning effect. Genuine engineering challenges that took manufacturers real time and real developmental resources to properly solve, right in the middle of an already turbulent regulatory transition. The third, and in many ways most consequential force, arrived with the 1975 model year: mandatory catalytic converters, required on virtually every new car sold in the United States to meet increasingly strict federal emission standards. Catalytic converters demanded unleaded fuel exclusively, since leaded gasoline would rapidly destroy the converter's internal catalyst material. They also imposed genuine exhaust flow restrictions, creating back pressure that further limited how freely an engine could breathe, particularly at higher RPM. A genuinely serious obstacle for the kind of free-flowing, high-compression engines that had defined the entire muscle car era. Unlike the gross to net rating change, which primarily affected how power got measured and reported, catalytic converters represented a genuine physical restriction on how much real performance an engine could actually deliver. The third, and in many ways most consequential force, arrived with the 1975 model year: mandatory catalytic converters, required on virtually every new car sold in the United States to meet increasingly strict federal emission standards. Catalytic converters demanded unleaded fuel exclusively, since leaded gasoline would rapidly destroy the converter's internal catalyst material. They also imposed genuine exhaust flow restrictions, creating back pressure that further limited how freely an engine could breathe, particularly at higher RPM. A genuinely serious obstacle for the kind of free-flowing, high-compression engines that had defined the entire muscle car era. Unlike the gross to net rating change, which primarily affected how power got measured and reported, catalytic converters represented a genuine physical restriction on how much real performance an engine could actually deliver. None of this happened in a vacuum, separate from the broader economic pressures this entire channel has already documented in previous episodes. Insurance companies had been raising premiums specifically on high-horsepower cars since the late 1960s, and that pressure only intensified as the new decade began, adding genuine financial incentive for manufacturers to advertise lower official horsepower numbers, regardless of how the underlying engineering had actually changed. A manufacturer facing an already complicated regulatory transition had every reason to lean into a lower advertised number wherever legitimately possible, not necessarily out of dishonesty, but because a smaller number on a window sticker could genuinely mean the difference between a car young buyers could actually afford to insure and one they simply couldn't. For an ordinary customer walking into a dealership during this exact window, the experience of driving these newly rated cars often didn't feel nearly as dramatic as the horsepower numbers on the window stickers suggested it should. Plenty of period road testers noted that cars carrying considerably lower net ratings than their gross-rated predecessors from just a year or two earlier still delivered genuinely comparable real-world acceleration, once you accounted for the measurement change rather than taking the raw numbers at their face value. That's not to say nothing had actually changed. By 1975 and beyond, once catalytic converters and further compression reductions had fully taken hold, the genuine measurable performance gap between an early 1970s muscle car and its mid to late 1970s successor became considerably more real and considerably harder to explain away through measurement technicalities alone. Despite this genuinely difficult, multi-layered regulatory transition, a handful of manufacturers kept finding creative ways to preserve genuine performance right through the middle of this entire period, exactly as this channel's earlier episode on 1972's Pontiac Trans Am 455HO already documented in detail. Pontiac's round port cylinder head redesign, Dodge's brief exploitation of the light truck emissions loophole with the Lil Red Express, and Buick's continued torque-focused engineering philosophy with the GSX Stage 1 all represent genuine engineering ingenuity deployed specifically to fight back against exactly the forces this episode has been explaining. The muscle car era didn't die from a single, sudden collapse in engineering capability. It wound down gradually, fighting every single regulatory and economic obstacle placed in front of it, right up until the combined weight of insurance costs, emissions regulations, and the 1973 oil crisis this channel has already covered finally became too much for the entire category to overcome. Decades later, this exact transition remains one of the most frequently misunderstood chapters in the entire history of the American muscle car, largely because it's genuinely difficult to explain in a single simple sentence. Horsepower dropped because of emissions regulations is technically true, but incomplete. Horsepower numbers dropped because of a new, more honest rating system is also technically true and also incomplete on its own. The real story requires understanding all three forces simultaneously: measurement, compression, and exhaust restriction, each moving at its own pace, each affecting real-world performance by a genuinely different amount, all converging into a single confusing narrative that most casual retellings of muscle car history still oversimplify into one flat, misleading claim that Detroit's engineers simply stopped caring about performance sometime around 1971. They didn't. They were fighting three separate battles at once and doing considerably better at holding the line than most people give them credit for today. So what does this entire story actually prove? That the apparent collapse of American muscle car performance in the early 1970s wasn't really one single event at all, but three separate, overlapping forces, each with a genuinely different cause and a genuinely different real-world impact, all landing within the same confusing few-year window. A new, more honest way of measuring horsepower made engines look weaker on paper without necessarily changing much about how they actually drove. Falling compression ratios represented a real, if generally modest, performance cut, driven by the industry's transition away from leaded fuel. And mandatory catalytic converters arriving by 1975 represented the single most significant, most physically restrictive change of the entire era. Understanding the difference between these three forces doesn't just clear up a persistently confusing chapter of automotive history. It gives Detroit's engineers from this exact period considerably more credit than they usually receive. Proof that even as regulation after regulation closed in from every direction, plenty of them kept finding genuine, creative ways to preserve real performance, right up until external economic and political forces finally left them with no room left to maneuver at all. Did you already understand the difference between gross and net horsepower ratings, or did this episode finally clear up why so many of your favorite muscle cars seem to have lost so much power between 1970 and 1974? Did your father, your uncle, or a neighbor on your street ever try to explain this exact confusing transition to you? Write the story in the comments below.